Just want to welcome everybody to our monthly 350.org meeting here in Milwaukee. And tonight we're really privileged to have a well-known author who writes for the National Geographic periodically, and this past December was the author of a major article which was featured on the cover of the magazine about the Great Lakes. And our special interest, there was a significant section on the impact of climate change on the Great Lakes region. And so we thought, oh, let's follow up on this.
So Julie,
Yes,
can I jump in here?
sure.
Well, I'll tell you, it was one December morning, and on the Sunday news, they announced the National Geographic's focus on saving the Great Lakes. And I looked it up, and later that day I was in Walgreens and I grabbed a copy of it and was like, wow. And we had our 350 steering committee meeting that afternoon, and I suggested that we reach out to Tim Folger, and he said, yeah, I got a hold of him, and he was wide open in terms of joining us.
Wow.
So I think we are so fortunate to have him with him. Excuse me a second. Yeah. Tim is a contributing editor at Discover and On Earth magazines. He's also the series editor of the Best American Science and Nature Writing, an annual anthology published by Houghton Mifflin. For the past 14 years, he's been living in a small town in northern New Mexico, Gallup, we were talking about that earlier, working as a freelance writer. His articles have appeared in National Geographic, Discovery, Scientific American, and other national publications. Many years ago, before a stint on a commune in the Sierra Nevadas, and long before he returned to college to study physics.
Yeah. Yes, welcome.
Oh, thanks very much. Really, thanks very much for inviting me. I feel privileged, first that I got this assignment, and now to be able to talk with people about it. When I did first get the assignment, it was in the summer of 2018. And my first reaction when my editor contacted me was like, why me? I don't really know anything about the Great Lakes. I live in the desert. Why don't you choose somebody like Dan Egan? You probably know him. He's in Milwaukee, writes for the is it the Journal Sentinel? Mm-hmm. And get somebody who really knows what he's talking about. But they for some reason they chose me, and so right now you're stuck with me, and so I'm happy to give what I think of as kind of my outsider's view of the lakes and their beauties and the challenges. What's been happening to the lakes in the past, what we can expect in the future. And as I mentioned to George a few minutes ago, I suspect that there are many of you, you live right along the Lake Michigan shore, so you probably know a fair amount more than I do about the lakes, and you've certainly been able to see the sorts of changes that have happened. They've been especially striking in Lake Michigan. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So I'd be interested, not just in hearing like your questions about the story or about anything I say tonight, but also maybe suggestions about things that I didn't include in the story, or maybe ideas for something that should be written about in the future, about the Great Lakes, or anything that Milwaukee 350 is concerned with. It's such a huge subject, and that was the challenge of the story. My editor basically said, well, we know we want to do something about the Great Lakes, but what are we going to say about them? And I kind of went into panic mode when I started this assignment. It just seemed like there was too much ground and too much water to cover. But one conversation that I spent the whole summer basically of 2019 doing the reporting for the story. I started in, the spring and the summer. I started in Cleveland in May of 2019, writing a short piece for Nat Geo's website about the 50th anniversary of the Cuyahoga River fire. You probably remember in 1969, the Cuyahoga River actually caught on fire, not for the first time. It had burned several times over about a 100-year period. But that last fire, and it was the last one in 1969, it was kind of a transformative event because following that fire, it was one of the things that really made people aware just how, what rough shape the country's waterways were in. That same summer, the Rouge River, I think it was near Detroit, also caught fire. So, a few years after these fires, the EPA was formed, the Clean Water Act was passed in Congress. So all these pivotal events, triggered by these horrible environmental disasters. And so one of the encouraging things, if looking at all the problems today, sometimes they seem so insurmountable, but at least the tributaries of the Great Lakes no longer catch fire. So that's some encouraging progress. I think one of the story I think started to gel for me towards the end of my reporting trip. I was in Duluth, Minnesota for about a week. And one day I had arranged with a professor at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, a biologist named Robert Sterner, to go out on a training cruise on Lake Superior for the day. This training cruise is kind of an annual event where, the professors take their grad students and even some undergraduates out on the lake to give them a taste of what research is like. They're training really the next generation of scientists, who will be, telling us, the state of the lakes, in the years ahead. And it was this beautiful day. We left Duluth before dawn, and we sailed out on Lake Superior. And the lake is so huge. Most parts of the world, when you talk about a lake, when you're standing on one shore of a lake, you can see the other shore. But of course, from Lake Michigan, when you're standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, you don't see the other shore. And on Lake Superior that day, as we were sailing out, we soon sailed out of sight of land, and we could have been on the ocean. And so the lake seemed so vast, and I was, standing on the deck with this professor, Robert Sterner, kind of saying that. I said, these lakes are so huge. It's this enormous body of fresh water. And Robert Sterner, he nodded, and off in the distance, maybe like, I don't know, quarter mile away from the vessel we were on, which was called the Blue Heron, there was this big freighter. They're called Lakers, about 1,000 feet long. I don't know if it was carrying iron ore, but it was this huge vessel. And Robert Sterner said to me, if you took that vessel and stood it on its end so that the stern of the ship was touching the lake bottom, its bow would actually break the surface. So he said, the lake looks huge, but and that's deep for a lake, 900, 1,000 feet. Not many lakes in the world get that deep, so it's deep. But still, Robert Sterner was saying, the lake, it's actually pretty shallow. When you compare its depth to its breadth, it's at the steepest point, Lake Superior is 1,000 feet deep, but it's hundreds of miles wide from east to west and north to south. And so it's really its depth compared to its breadth, that the lake is really kind of a thin sheet. And Robert Sterner said to me, well, you could make a really accurate 3D map of Lake Superior simply by tracing Lake Superior on a piece of paper, because it's really, on that scale, that the lake is a thin sheet of water stretched out over the land. And Sterner said to me, when you look at the lakes that way, that shows you how vulnerable they are. They look vast, and they are, from one perspective, but really they are these very delicate systems. And that really stayed with me. And I had that in my first draft, but it got cut. I was really hoping to leave that in so it would convey something of the fragility of the lakes. And another thing that I was surprised to learn, which also touches on the lake's fragility, is how relatively young they are. They started to form at the end of the last ice age. I don't know, somewhere 11,000, 15,000 years ago. But they really only took their present form, with the lake shore and the tributaries and the watersheds that we recognize today. They only took that form about 3,000 years ago, which is, there are human structures that are older than that. The pyramids in Egypt are considerably older than that. So these systems are really young, and and because they're so young, one scientist told me, the species that live within and around the lakes haven't had time to evolve the sort of complexity that you see in more mature ecosystems, say the oceans or a forest. So if an invasive species comes in, it can wreak, really a lot of havoc, because there's just not that built-in redundancy that other ecosystems have. So, for instance, like, close to home for all of you is, the state of Lake Michigan now. It's, and many of you probably know this better than I do, but I've been told it's a completely different lake than it was 20 years ago. And it's completely different because of these invasive mussels, two kinds of invasive mussels, zebra mussels and quagga mussels, that were first detected in Lake Ontario in the early 1980s. And I think by the mid-90s, they had spread to all the Great Lakes. And they're incredibly tenacious. They if they get on the bottom of somebody's motorboat, the zebra mussels have actually spread across the country. They're even in Lake Mead near Nevada, and they've even been found in California now. And they spread ultimately from the St. Lawrence Seaway. Carried, it's thought, by it came originally from the Baltic in the ballast water of ocean-going ships, and then when the ballast water was discharged in the St. Lawrence Seaway, along with the ballast water, invasive species like the mussels that were hitching a ride were also discharged. And since their arrival in the 80s, they've completely transformed, especially Lakes Michigan and Lake Huron. Lake Huron now has something like it's a hard number to wrap your head around, 950 trillion mussels carpeting the bottom of the lake. And first it was zebra mussels, then they were followed by quagga mussels, which were even more insidious, because zebra mussels needed some sort of hard substrate to live on. But quaggas can live on anything. They'll live on sand. They even live on top of other mussels. They live on top of zebra mussels. And there's 950 trillion. And if you do the math, that's like about 100,000 mussels in Lake Michigan alone for every single person on Earth. And these mussels are filter feeders. They siphon water from the lake, and then they eat the plankton and other small organisms in the lake. And there's so many of them that over the course of a few days, they can filter about half the water in the entire lake. This enormous quantity of water. So one invasive species expert, Hugh Isaac, he's at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, told me that Lake Michigan now, he says, if you look at it, and probably many of you know this better than I again, he said it resembles more like clear Caribbean water than lake it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, when it would be a little murkier, but murkier in a good way, because it was murky with life, murky with, phytoplankton, zooplankton that fish depend on. And, but that those beneficial plankton have been, basically swallowed up by all these invasive mussels. So, fish populations have suffered, and especially in Lake Huron, but also in Lake Michigan. So when you see those sparkling clear waters on a sunny day in Lake Michigan, it's not necessarily a good thing. So I guess when approaching this story, and now in hindsight, it seems like there were kind of three groups of problems, it seemed to me. I think one kind of broad category were problems that we can solve, we know how to solve, and we could solve them, given the will. Then there are, in a relatively short period of time. Then there are more difficult problems that might take many decades to solve, but could be solved. And then there are problems that are just unsolvable. It's too late. And the zebra and quagga mussel problem falls into that category. They've permanently changed Lake Michigan. There's no going back. There are just too many of them. There's no way to eradicate them. So that's kind of the bad news. On the positive side with invasive species, the way zebra mussels first entered the lake, as I said, was they were carried in the ballast water of ocean-going ships. But in the last decade, the United States and Canada, working with the United Nations, have enacted these new strict ballast water regulations that require any ship that's entering the Great Lakes to flush its ballast tanks with salt water, so that would kill any freshwater organisms that the ships might be carrying. And in the last decade, that has been a really effective law. And we went from having, I forget how many invasive species per year being introduced in ballast water to basically zero over the last decade. So that's a success story. So you have that category of problems that it's too late to solve, but then there are shorter term, more manageable problems, even though some of those problems can be pretty big. And probably the biggest one, which I spent a lot of time writing about in the story, was the pollution from fertilizer runoff from farms around the Great Lakes watershed, especially into Lake Erie from farms in Michigan and Ohio. This fertilizer runoff is like, it has all these nutrients, especially phosphorus, that is like, sugar for these blue-green algae that are always present in the lake. And then, in their in normal numbers, they're not a problem. But, if they're under the wrong conditions, where you have a lot of fertilizer runoff the way we do, especially in the western basin of Lake Erie, which is shallow and warm, and every summer, pretty much now. You have this pulse of runoff from farms which have been, fertilizing their fields in the spring. So you have all this phosphorus running into lakes that fuels algal blooms. The blooms can, stretch for tens of miles, from one side of Lake Erie to the other, and on the western end. And when these blooms die, as they sink to the bottom and decompose, they suck they suck oxygen out of the lakes, creating these dead zones. And the algae can also release toxins that are fatal to animals and can cause liver problems in humans. So, this was a problem scientists thought they had solved after the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act banned, various, like detergents basically from running into the lake. And from about 1970 to like 1990 or so, there weren't any algal blooms. The lakes looked like they were in really good shape, cleaner than they'd ever been. And then starting in the mid to late 90s, and then accelerating in the 2000s, the blooms came back. And why was that? It was kind of a mystery. Scientists eventually figured it out. And it was a strange combination of things. And climate change played a big role. It turned out that one of the in the mid 90s, to reduce soil runoff into the lakes, which is a desirable goal, a lot of farmers in Ohio and Michigan and elsewhere in the Midwest adopted this practice of no-till agriculture, where they reduced, or in some cases eliminated, the plowing of their fields. So that was effective in reducing soil erosion, which is good. But kind of perversely, it had the effect of increasing fertilizer runoff into the lakes, because since farmers were no longer plowing, they weren't plowing their fertilizer deep into the soil where it would remain. They were broadcasting it, on the surface or within the upper inch or two of the soil surface, so that during heavy rainfall, more phosphorus would be washed into the lake. And it took scientists a while to kind of piece this together, but this seems to be what's happening, that these new agricultural practices, which are in some ways beneficial, have had this disastrous impact on the lakes in terms of fueling algal blooms. And it's exacerbated by global warming. With global warming, one of the impacts, it seems, has been that it has destabilized the jet stream, these currents of air that kind of whip around high latitudes. But now the jet stream seems, because of climate change, it's becoming, occasionally it will dip further south than it had in the past. It will cause weather patterns to stall. It's basically changed the weather over the entire Great Lakes watershed. And it seems that one of the changes that is now, I think we're stuck with until we can somehow, start sucking carbon out of the air, is that more precipitation will be falling as rain and less as snow. And the precipitation won't be spread out evenly over the year. It's going to be, more sporadic and intense, especially in the spring. And this seems to be what's happening. Instead of these more moderate rainfall spread over a season, we're going to be having these, intense thunderstorms in the spring, which is just when farmers are, putting that fertilizer down. So, you have this, this combination of this climate effect of these more intense spring rainstorms with these agricultural practices combining to fuel algal blooms. That as daunting as that seems, we're stuck with the new weather patterns. There's not too much we can do about that, and those will be bad in other ways, which I'll talk about in a minute if I remember. But as daunting as the algal bloom problem seems, I'm told that it is a solvable problem. A researcher at a tiny university in Tiffin, Ohio, at Heidelberg University, it's called. They've done this amazing research. They've been studying the the western watershed of Lake Erie, and they were the people of the small university were really the ones who put together this picture of the no-till agriculture, the fertilizer runoff, and the spring storms, and but it's a solvable problem with. I'm not an expert on farming or agriculture, but Laura Johnson told me that with precision agriculture, we could have farmers could have machines. They would be expensive, so farmers would need to have some funding to do this. That would, drill the fertilizer down deep enough so that it wouldn't be exposed to spring runoff. And it's solvable in another way. The Clean Water Act regulates point sources of pollution like sewage plants, but it leaves largely unregulated many farms, especially factory farms in the Midwest. Small farmers, they're allowed some leeway under the Clean Water Act. They don't have to. There aren't just restrictions on the amounts of fertilizer they can apply, but there are restrictions on larger factory farms. But these larger farms, they'll skirt the regulations by, if they can document that they're just below the legal limit in terms of, the number of cattle or hogs or whatever they have on their operation. They can get away with kind of claiming a smaller farm status and be free of Clean Water Act regulations. So that's a problem that we could probably solve. Did you have a question, George?
No, I'm good.
Okay. And then, that issue of extreme weather, that's affecting many parts of the world, but, we're already seeing in the Great Lakes, in addition to making algal blooms worse, you just have the more direct effect of, what's going to happen to cities in the Great Lakes region as we see more of these intense storms. And a couple of examples in 2012 or 2013, there was an intense thunderstorm in Toronto that lasted just for one day, but it cost almost $1 billion in damages. It was the most costly natural disaster in Toronto's history. And Toronto's a city that had been implementing, kind of climate mitigation measures for some years, and still this one intense storm, really hit the city. When I was in Duluth, I spent a day with a city manager who was telling me how Duluth had been hit by, within 5 years, it had been hit by 3 intense storms, one of which was a so-called 500-year storm. But our kind of scaling of what's a 500-year storm is changing now, because you can't call a storm a 500-year storm if it happens a few times in a decade. But Duluth was hit by 3 of these storms. And, it's a relatively small city. And this manager said that, we're kind of at our limit now. We don't have, we just don't have the funds to go back to the state we were in before these storms hit. And I was asking one climate scientist about this, a man named Alan Hamlet at the University of Notre Dame, and he said that his concern was that, the sorts of, these sorts of storms, the sorts of changes that we're seeing now, the impacts of climate change are maybe outrunning our ability to deal with them. So yeah, that's the those are the problems that are going to take decades to address. Climate change. I guess one thing that I didn't include in the story, and I really would have liked to, was what does the future hold for the lakes? And in a sense, where we're all complicit in in the fate of the lakes. Not only because we all drive cars, and but even our diets. Something like 40% of the corn grown in the United States is used for animal feed. Another 40% goes to biofuels. So, we're putting food, or what could be food, into our gas tanks, and into into the burgers that some of us eat. And until that stops, we're going to be, and that those corn crops require a lot of fertilizer. The stuff that fuels those algal blooms. So, and it's depressing to think about, but we've all had a hand in the degradation of the Great Lakes. So I'm just going to look at an email that I got from one scientist, because I asked him, well, what do you think the future holds for the Great Lakes? So excuse me for a second while I just dig down to get this email. The professor's name was Don Scavia. He's at the University of Michigan. He's recently retired, but he had spent decades studying the Great Lakes. And in an email to me, he outlined basically 2 alternative tomorrows for the 5 lakes. And so in the email he wrote, I see two potential futures, both having in common a large migration of people from what will become an uninhabitable southwest and an underwater southeast. If the Great Lakes states promote conservation and sustainability, the entire region, although it will be warmer and wetter, could become a mecca for a population fleeing rising seas, droughts, and heat waves. On the other hand, he said, if current trends continue, the Great Lakes watershed might provide a temporary refuge, but they would inevitably continue to degrade until people will be forced to move someplace else. So that sense of, the part of the world where you're living now, if we're careful, it could become, it already is, this amazing, we have this amazing treasure of these lakes, and if we protect them, it could become this crucial area, for people seeking refuge from disasters elsewhere in the country. So I guess I've been speaking a little bit longer than I thought, so maybe I should stop, and maybe I'll just close with one thing, and open it up to questions. I know we had a map we were thinking of showing, but maybe we could look at that during the questions. We're not broken. Oh, okay.
Natin na bag lo na backpack.
Yeah, one if you look at that map and you see in the upper left part of it, Lake Nipigon, and
Video talaga. But I don't want my video to be seen.
okay,
Can everyone mute, please?
if you look at the upper left kind of corner of that map, you'll see Lake Nipigon, in the kind of the northernmost part of Lake Superior's watershed. And I was just talking with a scientist last week, and he said, if you look at that water, if that watershed around Lake Nipigon and Lake Superior, the water that enters there and trickles down into Lake Superior by rivers and streams, and it will take several hundred years, before it makes its way through, Michigan and Huron and down to Lake St. Clair, down into Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, then, out to the St. Lawrence River. So several hundred years. So the lakes have this really long memory, of what we've done to them. And when you think about it, it's, as the scientist told me, he said, if you stand at Niagara Falls today, some of the water that's going over the falls was in Lake Superior before Columbus reached the Americas. It's this amazing resource, and as large as they are, they're so vulnerable. I guess I could stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. And you've opened our eyes to just a lot of things, and within our group, we are very anxious to bring up the questions and the comments and also the suggestions that you were looking forward. Okay, we've got Susan Motter.
I can't see anything.
Go ahead, Susan.
Well, I just want to thank you so much. I read the article. I picked up the National Geographic and was enthralled to see such an in-depth article that really identified some of the things that you've talked about. So I want to just thank you. I think they chose the perfect person, even though you live in the desert, to come out to the Great Lakes. You just had probably such objectivity, and curiosity that it really worked well. I'm only commenting that I've experienced exactly those torrential rains in Upper Michigan by Lake Superior. I've been going up to a cabin my parents built off of Highway 13 that runs from the top of Lake Michigan to Lake Superior. And it's in the Hiawatha National Forest. And twice last year and the year before, I've gone up. I'm 67, so I've been up there almost every year. And I could not believe the torrential rain that went on for like 12 hours. And we couldn't stay at the cabin. We were in it was unbelievable. And the lashing of the forest trees and the winds. I never experienced such a, unbelievable experience. So that's just what I'm now offering, is how things have changed. And of course, it's difficult to hear that the climate now has changed over the entire Great Lakes watershed. I understand what you're saying, but there you go. Thank you again, though, for your speaking.
No, sure. Yes, thank you. And you reminded me of that torrential rain you were describing on Lake Superior. That until 2012, there had never been any algal blooms in Lake Superior. Because Lake Superior is the most pristine of the Great Lakes. It's cold and deep. It's not a place really that's a good habitat usually for algal blooms. But in 2012, there was like one of those torrential rainstorms that you were talking about, over in one day, it raised the entire lake level of Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes, by 4 inches in a single day. And in that same summer, after that rainstorm, Lake Superior saw its first algal bloom. And several years later, it saw its second. And Robert Sterner, he was the scientist who took me out on the research vessel and was talking about the depth of Lake Superior. He said that second algal bloom in 2018, he said was really bad. He said he made that stretch of Lake Superior, which was a little southeast of Duluth. He said it looked like an Iowa farm pond. It looked like the color of a melted crayon, green crayon.
So, go ahead, Dennis.
Oh, thank you, Tim, for your desert perspective. And one thing that you mentioned last, which is so deceptive, is people from other parts of the country, but even here in the Great Lakes area, think that we have so much water, which we do. But like you said, it takes the drainage is really slow. And I've heard anywhere from 50 to 100 years to fill the turnover, for the water to turn over completely. So if people come here thinking that we have all this water for industry and stuff, we really would be mining it. We would be draining it because it refills so slowly. The watershed's only about twice the size of the surface area of the lakes. But like I said, I've even seen articles here in Milwaukee or people that live here that think we have this endless supply of water. It's so deceptive.
Yeah, that's true. It goes back to that. While I was reporting for the story, frequently I would see these beautiful, maybe you've seen them too in museums, these beautiful kind of three-dimensional, almost like carvings of the topography of the lakes, and they would just show these, really pretty, and they would make them, they are deep, but it is like, as you said, it's deceptive because as that scientist Robert Sterner said, they really are just thin sheets and the most accurate three-dimensional map you can draw at a scale on a thin sheet of paper. You just trace the Great Lakes, and there you've got an incredibly accurate 3D, paper thin model of the lakes. They're much more delicate than they look.
Thank you. Julie Inslow, then Charlie Benzinger on the stack. Julie?
Thanks so much, Tim. One thing that I was really interested in was the fact Lake Superior is really the deepest of all the Great Lakes, has the greatest amount of water in it, and I think of any lake in the world, if I'm not mistaken, at least in surface area, it does. And yet it's, if I remember correctly from your article, you said that it was going to be the most affected by the increase in temperature from global warming. And that was the greatest threat because the other lakes were more impacted by population areas and runoffs from agricultural areas, whereas Lake Superior is more surrounded by totally natural areas. I took a trip totally around the perimeter. It took about 6 weeks to go around the whole perimeter and camping here and there and hiking up all the waterfalls that flow into it. And it's amazing how it's just totally in the wilderness. Most of it is. And yet that is going to be so impacted by the heat, and that's going to change it a lot. And could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the as you said, part of it is because Lake Superior is relatively pristine, so it's not going to be affected by as much, as the urban problems, say that happen in Lake Erie, or the agricultural problems, or, and because it's so distant from the St. Lawrence Seaway, it's relatively protected from invasive species. But I think maybe the biggest change we're seeing in Lake Superior now is the loss of winter ice. I wrote about this a little bit in the article that scientists, it's really difficult to study Lake Superior in the winter, just because, you can't get out there on the ice because it's too hazardous. So it's really kind of a mystery as to what's going on underneath the ice. But there have been some studies of lakes in the Lake Superior watershed in the winter that are more accessible. And scientists, this is fairly recent research that, these scientists went out, and it's kind of basic research. They just cut a hole in the ice, dropped down a camera to see what was going on down there. And they were expecting to see this, really not very much activity. It's winter, it's going to be kind of cold and dead underneath that ice. But what they found was that there was an amazing amount of life. These tiny kind of microscopic herbivores, the zooplankton, they call Daphnia. They're like little grazing, cows that eat algae. They were kind of booming along, and the algae themselves. The algae depends on. There are some species of algae and diatoms that grow on the undersurface of the ice on the lake, and the lake in the winter. It turned out it was I forget the exact number. I'd have to go back and look at my story, but it was, I don't know if it was 50 or 60 or it was comparable in bioactivity in those icy waters. The bioactivity was comparable to summer levels. It wasn't like a 1% or 2% of summer levels. It was like 40, 50. So it was lots of life going on there, and all this activity depended on the ice, because first of all, there's algae that, as I said, that lives on the bottom of the ice, and but then there are also free floating forms of plankton that need the ice cover too. Not just the ice cover, but the snow cover that sits on top of the ice. The scientists thought that they did a little experiment where they kind of swept off some of the snow off the ice to see what would happen. They thought, oh, maybe that would boost the productivity beneath the ice, more sunlight and more photosynthesis. But that wasn't what happened. There was less activity when they cleared off the snow, because it turned out the light was too intense. It was too much light. It was damaging the phytoplankton, the little basic microscopic algae, that their photosynthetic pigments were being overwhelmed by the amount of solar radiation underneath the cleared ice, but they thrived under the sections of ice that were covered with snow. And in this amount of bioactivity, it's crucial for the rest of the year, because it fuels, when fish start to hatch and young fish start to feed in the spring, they're eating this larvae and the zooplankton. So this winter productivity is important for that early burst of life in the spring. Without it, that burst of life, that trigger, wouldn't happen. And unfortunately, with climate change, where Lake Superior is losing its winter ice is shrinking, and another one of the predictions of climate change is that winds will be higher. So when there is ice, there's a danger that winds will be blowing snow off the ice. So clearing the ice, more solar radiation will be damaging those delicate photosynthetic phytoplankton. Not to mention the protective qualities that ice has for larger creatures like us. That when you have a nice barricade of ice around your harbor, like in Duluth, maybe you'll be buffered a little bit from the effects of winter storms. So yeah, the loss of ice is winter ice in Lake Superior. That's a huge problem, and that's one of those problems that falls into the category. Well, it's too late for us to do something about it, at least in the short term. I mean, it's going to be like a generational challenge. As you no doubt know, we've got enough, CO2 in the atmosphere now just to fuel, many decades of warming.
Would that
Thanks so
also be a
much.
problem for Lake Michigan? The less ice in the winter?
Yeah, I think for any lake that
Yeah.
that has significant ice cover, I didn't really talk with people. I don't have any direct news about that, but my impression is that that same holds true for all the lakes. And Lake Erie is it's kind of, all the lakes are different. Lake Erie is really shallow, so it has its own kind of suite of problems. But there it's the big problems for Lake Erie are like the algal blooms and the dead zones because of the deoxygenization of the water when the algal blooms die. In Lake Michigan, it's already it's already been permanently changed, and I'd be curious to hear if any of you have noticed that in your lifetimes, the change in the going from murky to like gin clear, as one scientist told me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just to that point, anybody seen a change in the murkiness to clear? Okay, hey, Richard.
Just
Yeah.
a comment on Lake Michigan, because I've lived in this area most of my life, is that it has undergone quite a few changes. I can remember 40 years ago, we used to get alewife blooms, and down at the lakefront, the beaches would be covered with dead alewives, and they'd be floating in the water and stuff. So we've had a number of problems, and obviously the latest one are the mussels, but the changes in the lake over going way beyond that, the last 60 or 70 years, I'm sure, because we used to have a sewer dump out in, I don't know, it was several hundred feet off the shore of the beaches in Milwaukee, where the Milwaukee sewage was pumped into the lake. So there's been a really significant change in the ecology of the lake in this area, and the mussels have certainly presented quite a problem, not only in cleaning what was probably a lot of pollution out of it and then going too far, but they're also clogging intakes and stuff for water intakes for the cities and things like that. So it's been considerable.
Well, Greg, thanks for covering that pretty comprehensively. Let's get back to the stack. We have Charlie Benzinger, Greg Walter, Bruce Wiggins, and then Susan Motter. Go ahead, Charlie.
Okay. Hi, Tim. Great article. Really enjoyed it. You talked a lot about the diatoms in the article and about the decreasing amount of diatoms. And you also mentioned, of course, they're really responsible for a good portion of the oxygen that we breathe. So is it true that the diatoms are continuing to decrease at this point?
Yeah, that's an ongoing problem in all the lakes. The amount of oxygen, it's mostly oceanic diatoms, that are, supplying us with oxygen. There are a lot of diatoms in Lake Superior, but the real suppliers of oxygen are the oceanic diatoms, and that was another kind of just astonishing fact that I wasn't aware of. That as one scientist told me, we always hear that the Amazon rainforest, is sometimes described as the lungs of the world, but it's really the diatoms that supply half the oxygen in our atmosphere, and that scientist Andrew Bramberger, he's at the University of Minnesota at Duluth. He said, he just really hammered it home for me. He said, take a breath, take another breath. One of those two breaths was supplied by diatoms. So yeah, these little, that was another point I really wish I could have emphasized more, and maybe it deserves a story in its own right. These small organisms that, that we really, that everything depends on, don't get the attention of like the more kind of billboard marquee type animals, as beautiful, as orcas or gorillas or giraffes or rhinos, or, we don't want to see any of them disappear, of course, but we probably aren't paying enough attention to, the smaller creatures that really make life possible on this planet.
And so is it the quagga mussels that are, I guess, filtering out the diatoms? And if they're doing that sort of thing, might they also filter out some of the antibiotic resistant bacteria that are being created by the CAFOs? Because we feed about 80% of our vaccines and our antibiotics to animals, and that stuff goes right out into their manures, into the surface waters, and right into the lakes. So I just wonder if they're capable of filtering out some of those viruses as well.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. One thing that I did learn about quagga mussels' filtering ability was that they're very selective. They'll filter. They like, perversely, the beneficial, plankton and bacteria, and they've actually. Once Humic Isaac, an invasive species specialist, told me that there are actually videos of quagga mussels spitting out the blue-green algae that cause algal blooms. They don't like them, so they'll disproportionately favor these. They consume the beneficial bacteria and spit out the ones that are most harmful. They don't filter them.
Too bad.
Yeah. So that's a good question about the antibiotics. I don't know. That'd be interesting. In some ways, I have read that maybe there have been, that quagga mussels have had some beneficial impacts on water quality, but it's just too extreme now in terms of the impacts of the whole lake, in terms of its ability to support life. They've they're stripping the waters bare in Lakes Michigan and Huron.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Tim. We've got Greg Walter, Bruce Wiggins, and more in the stack. Go ahead, Greg.
I was wondering if you got a takeaway, an impression as you travel around and talk to people, if a lot of for instance, mayors of cities and other public officials, people that have some influence on the direction of development in those areas, if they're getting a sense of urgency, and if they're relating these changes that they're seeing to climate change, and if that's changing their viewpoint and their interest in making changes.
I think I didn't meet with a lot. I met with a few politicians. I met with the mayor of Cleveland and the mayor of Toledo. The mayor of Toledo, Wade Kapsakevich, his city in 2014, they had to shut down their shut off the city's water supply for a weekend because of a toxic algal bloom. So he was very passionate about, the need for changes, regulation of those factory farms, or CAFOs, they're called, concentrated animal feeding operations, that are responsible for, the lion's share of nutrients that flow into Lake Erie. So with regulation, could go a long way towards solving that problem. And I guess my general impression with again, I didn't talk to a lot of politicians, but talking with farmers, even farmers who didn't believe in climate change, even though, one breath they would be talking about, oh, yeah, the strange weather that's happening, but I don't believe in climate change. And the mayor of Toledo told me that, a lot of business people in Toledo, the lakes are kind of this bipartisan issue. No one wants to, at least no one who lives around the Great Lakes wants to see them destroyed. I think everybody in the region appreciates them, and it's one of those rare bipartisan issues, I think, that people can get together on and say, yeah, let's protect this resource that 40 million people directly depend upon, and who live in the Great Lakes watersheds in Canada and the U.S. So that's my basic take. I think was kind of an optimistic one in that sense, that people who live in the region, I don't think they're no one really wants to see the Great Lakes harmed. When I was meeting with farmers, they said, yeah, one farmer said, I live 12 miles from the lakes. I take my kids there. I go boating there. I don't want to see those lakes ruined. So, but farmers are in a bind. I think a lot of them, they're raising corn because that's what they can sell for biofuel and animal feed. So, there aren't any incentives for them to plant cover crops or, to, enact, conservation measures to reduce runoff. There's some small funding available, but nothing on on the scale that we need. We really, that's something I talk about in the story, but I didn't really talk about tonight, was planting cover crops, and in the region's farms would go, that would be game changing in terms of fighting runoff into the lakes. And that's a very doable solution. I was really surprised. I always thought that, oh, gee, cover crops. I thought that was something that was kind of standard practice, since the Dust Bowl days. I thought we learned our lesson. But if you drive around the Great Lakes region now in the spring, I saw a lot of bare fields covered with water. If farmers had the incentives, those fields could be, planted with cover crops.
Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks. Bruce Wiggins and Susan Motter. Go ahead, Bruce.
Thanks for being with us tonight. I hope I can get in 2 questions. I think they're pretty short. I loved the photographs and all the graphics and charts in the story. One of the things I'm noticing, it talks about lake sturgeon being the large ancient fish that eat organisms on the lake by mussels and gobies. Is it just a problem there that there are so many mussels and so few lake sturgeon that they're just out of balance?
Yeah, extremely out of balance. I don't know what the numbers of lake sturgeon are, but yeah, it's just that the mussels now, that's kind of an established fact. There's no way to, just no way to get rid of them now. And thinking of, like if we try to introduce something, who knows, it might cause more problems than it would solve. Like one of the things that when I first started working on the story, this one scientist was telling me, when alewives, were a problem, like we were talking about in the 60s, in the early, you had these huge piles of them that had to be bulldozed away and created this terrible stench. So
I remember that.
Someone had this idea, well, why don't we introduce salmon, to go after the alewives, and that worked really well. It's probably something that wouldn't fly today, introducing like a big, top of the line predator like that into an ecosystem, but it worked. It controlled the alewives, and to such an extent, one scientist told me that when the alewives population started to plunge, because of all the salmon, some some fishermen were lobbying for seeding the lakes with more alewives so that we could feed, have enough prey for the salmon.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, I think our history is introducing one thing to try to solve another. And there's just, like on this graphic, they talk about 94 invasive species in Lake Michigan. So it's really crazy. So my other question, it has to do with School of Freshwater Sciences here in Milwaukee that's recently been established. Do you know, are they doing some studies of the ecology of the lakes? And I'm greatly dismayed, quite frankly, to hear you say that so many things are beyond control or beyond remediating. So I'm just wondering about the School of Sciences. I don't know if you wrote about it or if there's somebody from the school that can talk to us more about the work there, or else we can have them at a future meeting.
Yes, I didn't contact anyone at the School of Freshwater Sciences, and I think maybe I first heard about them through George. But that sounds like a great resource. Then when you mentioned invasive species, there's this other aspect of the Great Lakes. We talk about the Great Lakes as being threatened, but now the Great Lakes themselves host more invasive species than any freshwater system on the planet. So the Great Lakes themselves have become a threat to other watersheds in North America. We want to contain those species. We don't want them to, get into the Mississippi or, watersheds in southern Canada or the western United States. And, we've closed off some invasion routes like, the St. Lawrence Seaway. No more ballast water problems. It seems like that's good news problem. That's been solved. But probably the biggest invasive species threat now, maybe, or in the years ahead, might come from
Asian carp.
Carp. That's the big one. It seems like the Army Corps of Engineers is doing a pretty good job of containing them. But another threat is the release of like tropical plants and fish by people who are just emptying out their aquariums into streams and things. That these things might make their way into the Great Lakes. So I think there's going to be a push to try to kind of regulate that trade more and make sure there aren't these accidental introductions of tropical species into the Great Lakes.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Tim. We've got Susan Motter, last one on the stack. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, that's just a quick comment. When you asked Tim about personal experiences with Lake Superior, and as I mentioned before, I've been going up there many years, and about 4 or 5, well, the lake was always unswimmable. It was just so cold for decades. You could never, you could not go into it. But the last 4 or 5 years, I'm swimming out to the sandbar. So it's kind of a challenging perspective to experience that.
I've heard that. I heard that too from a scientist who enjoys sailing on the lakes, and he said the upper surface, he can actually enjoy going swimming in the middle of Lake Superior. The surface waters might be close to 70 degrees now in the summertime.
Yeah.
Tia Johnson wanted to get in the queue, so I'm giving it over to her.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. I'm the new chairperson for the Wisconsin NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Committee. And my question is, you had mentioned the algal blooms on the west end of the Erie, and that when they decay, they emit toxins. I'm wondering, what are those toxins, and are those toxins in large enough quantities or possibly could become in large enough quantities to be harmful to humans?
Yes, I'm blanking. Let me look at my story. Do I have my story open? But they can cause liver damage in humans, skin irritation, severe skin irritation in humans. I'm going to see if the toxins have a name. Let's see. Let me do a quick search here. Oops. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on their name, but yes, they can cause liver damage in humans, and they can be fatal to animals and pets. So during that water crisis in Toledo in 2014, people couldn't shower. Of course, they couldn't drink their water, and even boiling the water is useless because boiling just concentrates these particular toxins. So yes, yeah, they definitely, you don't want to mess with them. Some charter boat fishermen that I met have complained about being irritated just by kind of motoring through an algal bloom and inhaling the mist or getting the mist in their eyes. So you don't want to swim in water where you see any kind of greenish scum. You don't want to let your pets run in that water because it could be fatal for pets. But they're bad news, not just in the Great Lakes, but in all around the world, the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, lakes in China. Algal blooms they're an enormous problem. And maybe they deserve their own separate story. I can't find the names of the toxins. I might have them in my notes somewhere.
Thank you, Tia. And Tia, welcome to our circle.
Mhm.
Yes. Tim, we've had you for quite a while here. And on behalf of our group, I really want to thank you for the depth of answering our questions and comments. Are we with that, everybody? Absolutely. And really, want to thank you for your work. We need to take a little time to look forward to what's coming up with 350. But I, before you get off, and we were on the phone with Greg Walter earlier for the meeting. I just want everyone who's on our calls to know that Greg Walter does a great job of communications for our group, getting out the announcements, alerts, being the technical guy. And I just want to acknowledge that in terms of the team, in terms of putting on these monthly meetings. Thank you so much, Greg. I also, in the alert, in the last alert, and the invitation for this meeting, and it'll be probably in some common communications. Greg lists the city-county task force, the city of Milwaukee and the county in our joint task force on climate and economic equity. Linda Frank is on that task force representing the Sierra Club. I'm on that task force representing the Milwaukee NAACP. And we've just gone through our first year of planning and are going into our next phases. We've created some new community working groups. And this is important in terms of how we go forward to create our climate plan. And this is an opportunity. And at the same time, I want to caution that and Greg has got a link to go to the city to see what the working groups are and what they're about. But it's work, and it's volunteer work. And we're looking for people who are not only interested, but who have some expertise to bring to the table in terms of these areas outside of what we need from outright community organization, but I'm saying that we're moving into a very sophisticated level. It fits many of us on this call. Please look at that link that Greg put out to us. Thanks, Greg. Julie Enslow.
Yes. Well, I would just like to say that we can hardly ignore what's been going on in this country the last week or so. And it's been horrendous and frightening. And so the political scene has so much to do with what we're talking about because of the regulations that come from the federal government. And during Trump's last 4 years, he had a pretty much nonstop attack on environmental regulations and the future of our planet because of his refusal to deal with the issue of climate change. So now we have a new administration that, God willing, will be coming in another week, and one that seems to really take seriously the issue that we're all gathered around, which is climate change. And it seems as if there is some light at the end of the tunnel here as far as the United States coming again with some serious work to try to alleviate climate change and our role in producing it. So I just think that we need to recognize that and hope that we have a safe week or two to come, and that there's no more violence in our capital, and that we all can proceed with a sane policy towards developing an environment, to creating and sustaining an environment that we can live in and that our children and our grandchildren can live in safely and healthfully. So this is all very involved with the political scene, unfortunately. And it's not just a matter of you and me recycling or riding our bikes or whatever. These are some serious political decisions that need to be made. And this next meeting that we're going to be having next February, on the second Tuesday, is going to feature Matt Rothschild, who was editor of Progressive Magazine for many years, is a good friend of George and mine. And we were talking about someone to address the whole issue of gerrymandering and the redistricting for political purposes that's going to be taking place in the state of Wisconsin in this coming year. And Matt Rothschild now is the head of Wisconsin Democracy. Am I correct on that, George?
Wisconsin Democracy Campaign.
Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. And he's very, very knowledgeable and very involved in this whole issue of the redistricting and the impact that it's going to have on the serious decisions that are going to be made at this state, which would contribute to the issues that we're so concerned about. So he's going to be addressing that this next month. So we can look forward to seeing you with us again, we hope. And thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, Tim, for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to see you, family.
Thanks. Everybody be safe and healthy.
Yes.
Oh, well, let's go out with a little life here. And Tim, we have a chat that we use here in Milwaukee. And it came from, Julie and I have worked internationally, and it came from our work in Africa with Nigerian climate activists who had been fighting Dutch shell for decades. And so the root of this chat has to do with keep it in the ground, and the rest we've added. And so we all know that on Zoom you can't sing together. And so if I'll just lead it in, and if we can all be on mute and say it out loud, okay, it'll work. Climate justice.
Climate justice.
Keep it in the ground.
Keep it in the ground.
Keep the oil under the soil.
Keep the oil under the soil.
The gas under the grass.
Keep
The
the
gas
gas
under
under the grass.
Keep the coal in the hole.
Keep the
Keep the
coal
coal
in the
in the
hole.
hole.
System change,
System change,
not climate change.
Not climate
not
change.
Not
climate change.
change.
Renewable energy,
Global
Global
energy.
energy,
sustainable life,
sustainable
Sustainable
life.
life.
peace and love.
Peace
Peace
and
and
love.
love.
Thanks for joining us.